I'd love to open the conversation up here for those of you who have burning questions and want to make sure we have some time for that. We have a microphone set up right here. Please go right to it. We are recording, so to make sure that we have all of your questions recorded, just step right up to the microphone and you can form a line. We've got several minutes for questions.
Hi there. You guys hear me?
Not yet.
Okay. Well,
Yes.
Great.
Now
Great.
you're on.
So my name is Heather Furman. I'm with the Nature Conservancy here in Vermont. And thank you all. This conversation has been really great, Steve, Andrew, and Jane. I'm really intrigued by the water funds conversation that you brought up and hoping you can draw on that experience to answer some of my questions. We're in the process of developing a natural infrastructure blueprint here in Vermont for the Champlain Valley that really focuses on addressing water quality by protecting the highest priority areas in our floodplains and in our river systems for protecting water quality and community resiliency and habitat. And so that's a scheme where you're directing funds to those highest priority areas. And I'm wondering, we also have a clean water fund that's been established here in Vermont during the last legislative session. So I'm wondering, based on your experience with water funds in Latin America, are there some market-based incentives that we can be thinking about and applying to that water fund to help us really incentivize and catalyze the protection of our natural infrastructure?
Great. Sometimes there are market. It's not really necessarily straight out market, but it's trade, right? In this case, it's like downstream water users are basically bargaining or trading with upstream landowners to provide clean water downstream, and they can do that in a way that's cheaper than the downstream users can clean up the dirty water. So sometimes it's just figuring out how to trade, right? How do you put the beneficiaries together with those people taking the action? There are other cases where, in a way, there are market mechanisms, but there needs to be a policy pump at the beginning. So people talk about cap and trade. For those of you who don't know what cap and trade is, so let's say we want to limit the total amount of sediment coming out of a river system. So we establish a cap by government regulation. But we basically say, we don't really care who it is that cleans up within this basin, but we just have to have a cap at the end. So we'll distribute permits to farmers or landowners so that they can have this, and then they can trade amongst themselves. And if somebody can take an action to reduce sediment, which is great. So economists love the trade part, but you got to have the cap first, or nobody's actually going to pay for this stuff. So it's a combination. It's not pure market. It's a combination of regulatory action and market activity.
Yeah, come on up. I should also mention, as a radio person, these mics drive me crazy, but you have to be very, very close. So bring out your inner, I don't know, Bieber, probably not Bieber, bring out your inner Beyonce and get as close to the mic as you can.
So I'm a student here at UVM of both policy and agriculture, so sorry if this is a little pessimistic. But so as you said, land sparing is this highly theoretical and still something that needs to be very specified. But even though developing nations make a great testing ground for agroecological processes like that, how can we account for the time and effort that's going to take when there's building pressures of famine and poverty and climate change?
Good question. So I guess we look at we're not looking at taking land out of production in the meantime, and as a result reducing production through while tinkering goes on. A good example of this sort of thinking happening in practice is happening now in some quite large areas of the Brazilian Amazon. Some of you will probably know this part of the world better than I do, but we're working with Brazilian colleagues. One of the main drivers of the first big wave of Amazon deforestation was clearance for cattle production. And if you go across that region, as an outsider, you'll notice there are very, very few cows in those cattle producing areas. Yields are way lower than they might be, and so with colleagues down there are working on a program to work out how to enable and incentivize farmers to boost cattle yields, so that they can then accommodate the next big wave of agricultural expansion going on there, which is soy expansion. They can accommodate soy expansion without having to take any more forest out of production. So you get your incentive as a farmer If you don't take any, you get help with your yields if you don't take more trees out of the system. So overall production is going up, farmer incomes are going up, and the footprint of farming is staying the same. So that's an example where the experiment, and it is being run on an experimental basis, isn't reducing production. In fact, it's increasing production. It's just trying to work out, can we do this in as least painful a way as possible.
So if I can just build on that, many places in developing countries have what people call yield gaps. In other words, if you look at kind of the climate and the soil, and you compared it to some other place in the world maybe that's more developed, the yields in some places are far higher than they are in many developing countries. So that's actually an opportunity, just as you said. You can actually, by improving access to markets or improving access to fertilizer, you can greatly increase the yield. Now that's both good and bad in the following sense. It's good because it gives higher income to farmers. It's good, it produces more food, perhaps where there's more pressure to do so. So that's all good. There's never a pure win, however, because now it's like, oh, well, now it's more profitable to farm here. So you might be putting more pressure on locally if you actually solve this yield gap problem. So you need to think carefully about how can you increase the income of farmers and the yields and the food production, but do this in a way which is also going to maintain protected areas, biodiversity, water quality, because you're going to be increasing nitrogen, fertilizers, and so forth. So it should be done mindful of these trade-offs. Oftentimes, it is not. Yeah.
Is there always going to be a trade-off, though? Can you do all of those things at once and replicate that around the country or around the world?
In one sense, you can be smart about things. Like if I said, well, here's my goal in terms of food production, and could I produce food or even more food and do this in a less harmful environmental way? Absolutely. I mean, we can shift where crops are grown, how they're grown. There's a lot of leeway. I mean, one way being so bad at things right now is there's lots of room for improvement. So the question is, how do you actually how do you structure it so that you get the information to the farmers, that they have an incentive to do this, and that's where I think even right now it's not a question so much of the science as a question of sort of getting incentives and institutions and knowledge into the right hands.
I'm going to build right on that point and ask, does high efficiency necessarily mean very large scale? I have a friend who's an organic farmer in Vermont who claims that he gets the same yield per acre as chemical farming. He admits to getting a much, much, much lower yield per farmer hour. But he says, I pay for labor and a chemical farm pays for petroleum, and we end up with about the same cost of inputs. I'm just paying it to farmers, and he's paying it to truckers. And on a similar point about housing, does high-efficiency housing necessarily mean New York City, or could it mean the center of Richmond? Could it mean living in small, beautiful towns, but not living on 10-acre lots?
So I can answer the first of those. I've never been to Richmond, so I can't.
Richmond is a town of about 5,000 in Vermont that I use just as an example because a lot of people here will know it.
Yeah, and it's representative of most of the towns in Vermont, which are a couple to several thousand.
So on the first of those points, no, it certainly doesn't mean large scale. So I can't underline enough that what we're talking about when we're thinking about a land sparing solution isn't about intensive farming business as usual. It's about high yield farming and the least bad way to get to that. And there are many examples which involve small scale farming. To give you one of my favorites, it comes from around the Great Lakes region in East Africa, particularly around Lake Victoria, where some of those people in the Agricultural Research Institute I mentioned a while ago, which has pioneered a lot of the early insecticides and is seen by some as a house as a place where bad things are invented. Those people are working very hard on trying to take pesticides out of the system. They've done some very clever work on what's limiting yields in maize in that part of the world, main crop, where the main limit is something called a stem borer moth, which comes in, lays its eggs inside the stems of the maize. The larvae hatch out. The stem becomes weakened. It falls over. The crop rots. They've looked using their very clever chemistry at how the moths, how the moths find the maize. They cue in on chemicals the maize gives off. They then looked at a whole load of other plants in the same place that farmers were familiar with, and used the moths to assay how exciting the different plants were. And they found maize was quite sexy. They quite liked maize. There were certain plants which they found really attractive, and some they found really horrid. Turns out some of the ones they found really horrid are leguminous. They fix nitrogen. So they've got the farmers to put that in amongst the maize crop. The moths find it repellent. They leave the fields. Meanwhile, the maize gets fertilized by the legumes. And as they leave the field, the farmers have then planted a trap crop of these super sexy grasses around the outside that the moths can't resist. They lay their eggs in them. Because these grasses have co-evolved with the moths over millennia, they also know how to cope with their eggs. So when the larvae hatch out, they cover them in gloop and the moths die. So this system is called push-pull farming. You push them out of the fields into the hedgerows. It boosts farm yields. It's done on a farm-by-farm basis. It's still small-scale agriculture. And because yields are much higher, farmer labor needs are higher, and rural employment's going up. So people that were drifting off to very disconnected lives in cities are coming back, staying on the farm. And so social capital is improving at the same time. So that's using small-scale farmers to boost yields.
In terms of, I'm not going to be able to answer as authoritatively on the city side, but the real point here is how much land per person are you taking up? You can live densely in a small community. It's just that there are only 5,000 people as opposed to 5 or 20 million people in that community. I think the real question is how do you organize it? How much land is that community taking up relative to the population?
But beyond that as well, there have to be certain social structures that are in place. There have to be jobs. If you want somebody to both live in their small community and work there, so they're not just living there and commuting to Burlington, then there has to be either a job market there or some sort of telecommuting possibility.
Right.
And what does it take to get to that position?
Well, you said part of it, which is, we actually now, there is much less reason for many jobs to be in particular places than there used to be. The telecommuting is a good idea. I mean, I don't necessarily need to be every second in Minnesota, for example. Taylor and I work together, and we do that electronically. So there are ways to basically change the job location equation so that you don't have to be fixed in one place. How do you do that as a policy? I don't know. I haven't thought about that, but yeah.
I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions.
Hi, I live in Vermont, and so I'm very much in favor of local options. But we do seem to have some problems that are bigger than that, specifically global warming, and for that we want a solution, quote unquote, that is fast enough, and you mentioned speed. We also want it to be big enough, which you haven't talked much about. So here's my question. I heard a passing reference to the Paris conference. What do you hope will happen there? And specifically, do you expect any solution that doesn't involve a price on carbon?
On the first of those, I'm hoping for an agreement. I guess, which would be a major step forward, and an agreement that has the vast majority of nations signing up to it. So I welcome the fact, hopefully, that Canada will be back on board. I'm not holding hopes for Australia, but China and India. An agreement in the first place would be something. But I completely share your concerns that this needs to be bigger scale and faster than anything that politicians currently seem prepared to sign up for. But at least having people not walking away and being back on an upward trajectory in terms of what's going on in conference of the party meetings would be a step in the right direction.
So if I can comment really quickly, Bob. You're right. This is a global problem. It's not going to be solved by little local actions. We need large-scale actions. We need, frankly, that's why people are pinning their hopes on Paris, even though, how many years has it been where these UN conferences come back with nothing? I think you asked what do we hope for. Yes, I hope for an agreement. I hope that they actually establish a cap on carbon such that we could limit to 2 degrees. What am I realistically expecting? I'm actually expecting them to take some steps forward. In fact, they already have. So you have China saying we are going to take actions which will start to reduce our carbon emissions. You have India for the first time saying we are going to take actions. So you've got the major players now that are doing a majority of the emissions in the world currently. So, you know, the US, China, India, European Union, India, they all are now on board saying we are going to step up and take some actions. Now, whether that's fast enough or serious enough, I don't know, but at least that's a much more hopeful place than we were 2 years ago, where we were stuck in this sort of north-south, you know, you've got to move first, and the U.S. saying, well, we're not going to do something unless you do. So, you know, I'm actually, again, I don't know if it's fast enough, and I don't know if they're going to go far enough, but it's a much more hopeful place than I was 2 years ago.
All right, let's see if we can squeeze the last 2
Sorry.
questions in. Good. Now this.
Hello. Can you hear me? I wanted to go back to the point about your advice to the people in the room and what they can do. I think that we're all very privileged and lucky and fortunate to be listening to this talk, but what would your advice be if we bring in inequality to this question? So the people that can't be fortunate to be listening to these topics, what can they do? If they aren't necessarily considered part of the system, how can they affect the system?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because we haven't really talked about equity. And sometimes when I'm talking, you know, I'll say that, you know, the 2 biggest problems in the world not only are it's really sustainable development. The 2 sides of that are, how do you solve inequality? How do you bring people up? And there's an economic dimension to that, but as you say, there's a political dimension to that too. I mean, people can be having enough to eat, but they don't necessarily have a voice in the system. You know, part of this is we really do need to take the development part of sustainable development seriously. I mean, we do need to raise people up out of poverty. I mean, I take that as you know, that's as important to me, solving that well, I mean, if we don't solve the environmental problems, then nobody's going to live well. So, you know, maybe that does take precedence, but that other part of this is really important. I'm not a political scientist, and I don't have a good answer for how do we bring in the disempowered into the political system. Clearly it's important. You know, there are steps that people push, you know, the really opening up and democratizing things and, you know, letting people have more say. But that's a hard one, and especially in some countries where, you know, you've got very centralized power that doesn't want to let go. And I don't have a good answer for that one.
Lisa.
You don't have time for me, do you?
No, go for it, Lisa. We'll have time for you.
Just I have a
Always.
short question on land sparing. Over the world, especially in the developing world, but in the United States too, whenever the government puts land aside to keep it for conservation, there's a lot of pressure from surrounding farmers to find some way to use that land, to take the trees, to grow the corn, or to run their cattle without paying the government for it. Have we worked out what it's going to cost to protect the land that is spared, rather than leave it in private hands?
Yep. Yes, people have got some handles on that. In fact, in a previous life, I used to play with a different bunch of economists who helped me with some of those things, trying to think about what those costs are. And they're very substantial. And as a conservation community, we tend to focus on the obvious front costs, so the management costs. What does it cost to patrol the protected area or manage the trees in a particular way or whatever it is? And those are easy to measure, and they're small, relatively speaking. We still don't spend anywhere near the amounts that we need, but they're small. What are much more substantial are the opportunity costs that you're talking about, what people forego as a result of that area no longer being available for straightforward development. And those costs are much, much greater. They're very convenient to overlook, because you know, if you have government by diktat, you can kind of ignore them for a while and hope they go away. Of course they don't, but you try to. And so I think the conservation communities tended to ignore those at their peril. However, when you do look at those costs and you start to factor them in and think about how you would pay them, perhaps through compensation schemes, perhaps through all sorts of alternative ways of trying to meet people's foregone opportunities of conservation, even though they are much larger than the kind of numbers that conservation communities, the conservation world thinks about, or that we currently spend on conservation, they're still tiny compared with the costs of the benefits that we would lose if we lose those places in terms of ecosystem services. Not everywhere in the world, but in many, many places, the benefits, if we were to account for them properly, outweigh those real costs. So the trick is, I think, then thinking of the sorts of things that Steve was talking about, and going back to the previous question about Paris, about putting prices on some of those values and then working out equitable ways of distributing the benefits back to the people who pay the price for foregone conventional development.
We've reached the end of our time here for this portion of our conversation, but I want to let you all know that there is a reception just out the hallway, and so we're going to carry on this conversation, all of us together. But before we let you go, let me first of all thank Taylor Ricketts and Brendan Fisher, who are co-hosting these lectures today. Thank you very much for putting this on. Brendan, I think, is in the back somewhere. And also, please join me in thanking our very distinguished guests today. Andrew Balmford is a Burack Distinguished Lecturer for the academic year, and Stephen Pulaski is a UVM James Marsh Professor at Large. Thank you both very much for your insights.